Hey everyone, welcome back to yet another episode with Coffee Time with Mr. Ying. We have an extremely fun episode today. We're going to be talking about how to stand up your own API for a large language model that perhaps you fine-tuned or that you have locally on your computer. And we're going to be diving into Docker container, Lambda functions, API gateway, and all that fun stuff. So with that being said, let's get started. First things first, I just want to take your attention to the screen. This is the Streamlit application that we did before in previous episodes, and what we have here is a language model, right? Here you can choose a model. You can say ChatGPT, that points to the API endpoint of OpenAI's ChatGPT function, or you can say PaLM, that points to the API endpoint of Google's PaLM, or alternatively, you see the second option here says Ying. That is my own API that I stood up on AWS. So for example, you can say, hi, tell me a joke, and you say send. And this point, the Streamlit application will make that API call, point to the endpoint, and grab that function in the backend and return a response. So the response here says, hey, that's a joke, right? What did the fish say when it hit the wall? Damn. So we're going to walk through the back end of what happens when you click this submit button. So before we get started, let's talk about the system architect. This is a picture I draw for system architect. I know that different people draw a different way. This is just how it makes sense to me at the moment. I'm not saying this is a perfect way. It's just a way to demonstrate what my idea is before we jump into the tech stack. So first things first is you have your Lambda function. So that's the body. That's where the magic happens, right? So in this Lambda function, we're going to be backed up with an ECR container. So this is going to be an image in the ECR container. And then the ECR container come from somewhere, right? We're going to build a Docker image, push it up to the ECR container. And in that Docker image is Python, and then Python will make a call to OpenAI function. So that's why I draw an arrow from OpenAI point to Docker container, and then from Docker container point to ECR, and then from ECR point to Lambda. So all that stuff is now inside of this Lambda function. But the Lambda function is still private, right? I need to build an API gateway to point to the Lambda function. So once API gateway is triggered, it will run the Lambda function. The Lambda function will return some response, and we'll get that response. So this is the full picture. And that's the idea of the system architect. Now, let's jump into the code and tech stack to take a look what that looks like. So first things first, let me take your attention to the Python function that you need to design for that Lambda function in AWS. So let me take your attention to the VS Code. That is the IDE that I used to design that Lambda function. This is the body of the Lambda function. First things first, I need to import all these libraries. JSON, OS, these two libraries are building in the Lambda function on AWS Cloud. So these two things you don't really have to install it. But here, I want to keep things simple. Instead of having a fine-tuned model locally, I just want to make an API call to the OpenAI function. Let's say that's the language model I'm using, right? To do that, I need to import OpenAI. I'm sure all of you guys have seen on notebooks, online, via other channel, other resources, that if you want to call ChatGPT locally on your Python, you need to import OpenAI package. And that's precisely what's happening here in this script. So with that package imported, now the second thing is obviously your API key. In this case, I'm not going to show you guys my API key, but that variable is there. To keep things simple, I just set it as an environment variable. And we're going to talk about what that is in the Lambda function. But that API key needs to be there, right? Otherwise, I can't really make the API call of OpenAI function. So here, I have this Python function called call ChatGPT, in which case here I'm making an API call to point to the OpenAI function. In this case, it's a completion function. And the prompt is a variable. That's the input argument for this function. In this case, it's a string. And that allows the user to ask a question. Tell me a joke, right? That's a string. That's a sentence. And that sentence going to this function, and that becomes the input argument for OpenAI.completion. And the answer from OpenAI is in this object called response. I grabbed the text, that's the answer, and then I return it. So that is essentially how the function works. Now, I wrap it up in a call ChatGPT function. I'm calling that. So this is the Lambda handler. The Lambda handler is kind of like the main component of a Python script. And specifically, there's an event and there's a context. For the sake of this exercise, I'm not touching context just yet. I'm only looking at event. So I want to stand up an API for the Lambda function. And I want the user to be able to look at the URL of that API and then enter some strings, right? In this case, I want to enter two strings. The first one is query. That query is whatever question the user is asking, right? Tell me a joke. That's the query. The second thing I want to use is key. This key here, I have a default key called 123. That means that if a user checks 123 as a key, then that key matches, and I will call the actual function. Otherwise, if the key is not 123, it's some other value, right? 125 or 789, then I will not be calling ChatGPT. I will only be returning, hey, please enter the correct key. So have a little bit of a security going on there just to check whether the string matches. And in this case, something simple, 123. So with that being said, that gives you the answer. And that answer need to pack it together and the Lambda function need to return it, right? So I packed up the answer in a JSON file called a process RESP. So in other words, process response. And then here's when things get really interesting. I need the Lambda handler to return an HTTP object, right? So this is actually the code to design what that object is. So I start with HTTP RESP, that's gonna be an empty dictionary, and then I start giving it status code, headers, and then once I give it the headers, I need to design the content type of the headers. In this case, I want to make sure it's a JSON file. So I say application/JSON. And then I need a body, right? Because otherwise it doesn't know what to dump the answer to. So I say HTTP RESP body, and then I set that equal to JSON dumps. So this JSON dumps is why in the beginning I need to import JSON. So that's the package that pack the response together. In this case, the response is all stored in process RESP. So that gives you the body, right? Now after all of this, everything's done. I can then return HTTP RESP. That's gonna be what's coming out of that Lambda function. You can test it locally, you can test in a notebook, you can do whatever you want, but once you test this code, it should be able to run. And now you need to get this thing on AWS, right? So how do we do that? You can copy the code, go into the Lambda function and paste it in there, but I'm gonna do things a little bit differently, right? Because I don't know the size of this OpenAI package. I don't wanna deal with that. If I copy paste the code, I need to get the package in there. I just don't want to go through all that trouble. So what I'm going to do to make my life easier is to create a Docker image. So in order to do that, you need to have Docker desktop installed locally and have it open and running. So that is the first step you need to do. And obviously you want to tag it with the correct version, right? Otherwise, you don't really know what identifier you want to call. So let me show you what that looks like on the AWS website. So I'm logged into my AWS. This is my personal account. That says Yi Xiaoying. And as you can see right now, I haven't really used it much, right? It charges a monthly cost of $1. So I haven't really used it that much. But I do want to tell you guys as a reminder that it does charge you money, right? When you create this account, you have to put in your personal bank account, credit card information, all that stuff, right? So obviously, as a reminder, make sure that whatever service that you use, turn it on, turn back off after using it, right? Keep up a good habit, otherwise it will charge you money. So that's my console. The first thing I'm going to do is go to Elastic Container Registry. So there you go, that's your ECR service. It says Amazon Elastic Container Registry. That is the area where I could push a Docker container image onto. So let's go to repository, and then here I already clicked one saying my OpenAI test 1. So I click on that, and then that is essentially where I'm gonna send that image to once I use Docker to build it. And the fun thing here is it actually gives you the command that you need to run this thing locally to build it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh this a couple of times, and you see this version is latest v1. That is the latest version that I just created, right? I can do it on the spot and show you guys the code a little bit. So you grab that AWS CLI, it will log you in, verify the credentials, and once you get it done, it will say login succeeded. If not, then you're going to have to go to IAM to verify your key, your password, credentials, your key value, and all that stuff. So next thing I'm going to do is to build the actual thing, right? Once this is built, you are done. Now I'm going to tag this image with a new number and then push it onto AWS ECR. So I'm copying this and I'm pasting here, except that here I need to say v2 because the previous version is v1. And in order to make a difference to show you guys how that works, now I'm saying v2. So I hit enter. Now this image is tagged. The last thing I need to do is to Docker push and push that image onto ECR. So I come back to this page, I copy that, last line of code, I say Docker push. And in this case, make sure that you're pushing the correct version, right? I tag v2, so I need to say v2. I hit enter, now it will say push this thing onto ECR. Now I can come back to my ECR, I'm gonna refresh the screen, and you guys will be able to see a v2 version. And boom, there you go, right? So then I can copy the URI. Now I'm gonna go to Lambda function and then trying to create a new Lambda function in there. So I just created my Lambda function. It's called my OpenAI test. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to image, and then I'm gonna say deploy new image, and then I'm gonna paste that version 2 tag number of that container from ECR service in here. And I'm gonna say browse image, and you will look for that image. And I'll say select image, and I'll say save, and then wait a little bit, it will say, function updated. So now that's successfully being updated. So I just have to make sure that I have an environment variable that's the OpenAI API key. So I'm going to try to hide that API key from you guys. So that's why I have this VS Code here. But you can see the configuration, the environment variable here says OpenAI API key. And that's where I store my personal API key for this Lambda function, because inside I'm making the API call to the API endpoint of OpenAI completion function. So now all of that is done, right? I have my Lambda function. I know what's in there. It's an image built by Docker container. And then I can go to ECR to check out which version I'm using. And if that doesn't work, I can go to my VS Code and check out the Python function, the Python script, to see where that it goes wrong. So all that's done. But now this thing is still private, right? It's not public in the air. It's not like everyone have access to it, right? How do I make that happen? I need to create an API for this Lambda function. So the way I do that is I go to API Gateway and I create this API called my OpenAI API test 1. So you can say create OpenAI, and the one I use is REST API. So say build, and then you can say REST, say new, and then here you can probably say my OpenAI API test 2, just as an example. And then you just hit create API, and then it will bring you to this page. Nothing's in there right now, right? We need to create something. So first thing you do is create the resource. And here you need to say something that somewhat makes sense, right? You can say my OpenAI test 2, and then I can say create resources. Now that resource is there. Now you need to create a method, right? I'm gonna create a get method because I just need to get the information. That's all I need. So I hit check, and then it will bring me to this page. It says get setup. So specifically here, I know I have a Lambda function ready. So that's the type I'm checking. And then here, I want to specifically make sure that I want to use the Lambda proxy integration, because Lambda proxy integration will allow you to use that event, right? In that event, what do we have? We have query, right? We have key, right? That's important stuff. Without that, the Lambda function won't run. So I need to make sure that I check that box. And then the Lambda function is whatever the Lambda function I just created, right? My OpenAI test 1. So done, I say save, and then I can say, okay, now this API is created. I can test real fast, right? Here's when things get interesting. I have query strings here as a variable that I need to enter, because this is what the function requires. So what exactly is the function asking for, right? Let's go back to the VS Code and let's check out the actual function. So in the Lambda handler, what do we have? We have event. And what's in the event? There's a query, there's a key, right? These things are variables that I need to tell the Lambda function. Same thing in the API, I need to tell the API that those are the variables, because without that, this function won't run. So I need to tell computer what is query, I need to tell computer what is key. Query is a question, I'm just gonna say tell me a joke. The key is a number. Here I'm matching it with 1, 2, 3, and only when it matches 1, 2, 3 will I call ChatGPT function. So I'm going to start with another number, and it will fail it. It will say, please provide the correct key. Or if I do 1, 2, 3, it will actually call it. So those are two things that I need. So I go back to my API. I say query equals to tell me a joke, and the key is 1, 2, 5. Now we know that 1, 2, 5 is not the correct one. You will say fail, right? So let's say test. And then it returned a JSON file, means that it's successful. And then the question is tell me a joke, but the answer says, please enter the correct key. Well, that makes sense, right? Because it's not 1, 2, 3, it's 1, 2, 5. Now I'm going to change that to 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to say test. Now it returns something that is from the OpenAI endpoint. So in other words, what's happening here is the Lambda function will grab these query, grab this key as input variable in that event, and then the API will let the Lambda function access the event and use the query and the key in that event as a variable. And then the Lambda function make that API call to ChatGPT website and send that question, in this case is tell me a joke, into that prompt. And then whatever that OpenAI API endpoint returned, let's return it back in here in this Lambda function and return it as part of the JSON file. So that's what's happening here. In this case, it says, why don't scientists trust atoms? Because they make up everything. So it is a joke, and it is exactly what I asked for. So now we know that this API worked, right? We tested, it has a response, it worked. That's how it's supposed to be. That's the response that we expected. So now what's going to do is we got to stand it up, right? We got to deploy it. So this is how we do it. We go up here, we say actions, and we say deploy API. And then I'm just going to make it simple. I'll say dev, right? Because this is not in production yet, right? It's just a dev version. I say deploy. Now it will bring me to this page. I will click on dev, and I click on get. There is this URL that you can invoke it. So that is how we interact with that Lambda function. So now we're pretty much there, right? We can grab that URL. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to go to new web browser. I'm going to say question mark. I'm going to say query equal tell me a joke and key equal 1, 2, 6. In this case, we know that 1, 2, 6 is the incorrect key. So we're expecting that the Lambda function doesn't invoke the ChatGPT call. So we say enter, it will say, tell me a joke. Answer is, please enter the correct key. So it hasn't really invoked the API endpoint for OpenAI, right? Even though I already invoked the API endpoint for this Lambda function that I just created. So how do we do that? We need the correct key, right? Here we say 1, 2, 3. That's the correct key. We hit enter. We wait a little bit, and now it will say, tell me a joke. The question is, what did the fish say when it hit the wall? Answer is then. So there you go. Now we're a full circle, right? We know the Python code going into the Lambda function. We built a Docker image. We push the Docker image to the ECR container. We build a Lambda function in AWS backed by that particular image in the ECR container. And we stand up an API endpoint that's pointing to that particular Lambda function. We made the API call, and it worked. This answer is exactly what I expected. Here we have a JSON file. It's a question. Tell me a joke. That's exactly what I just said here in that URL. And then we have an answer. So now we're at full circle. So now everything is all set. I know that this URL works, and then it's doing what it's supposed to do. All is left is the front end, right? We have that Streamlit application. We want the Streamlit application to make an API call to our own Lambda function. And this URL is precisely the URL I will be using. So we're gonna close that page. Now we're gonna go to the VS Code and go to that Streamlit application. So before we jump into the code of Streamlit application, which is very clumsily written, my bad for that, I need a function to make an API call, right? And nothing is easier than the request package in Python. So here I have a function that says call in test1. The input argument is a URL, right? It's basically a giant string that's a URL. And then I make a GET request. The GET request in Python will make an API call using that URL. In this case, it's a URL that we just talked about from the GET request that we created from that resource in that API for the Lambda function. And then this function will return the response. So you could literally say, hey, query is tell me a joke, and then we add a URL in there. That's a URL that we just saw. And then you say response data is equal to call in test1 function that's defined up here. And then the response, you can print that out. It will say, tell me a joke, and the remaining part is the answer. So now we have a function in Python that makes a GET request, and that GET request uses a URL that we stand up using API gateway in AWS service, and that API is pointing to a Lambda function that makes an API call to OpenAI ChatGPT. So that is a full circle. And then the last thing we need to do is copy paste this function in the Streamlit application, right? So what I have here is the model name equal to st sidebar. St sidebar radio is referring to that sidebar that you saw earlier with the circular button that you can press on. And here I specifically added yin as a button. So that's why you're able to see this yin button on the Streamlit application. So I have that button designed, and that's one of the model choices. So when user click on that model name will be yin in this case. It's a string because that's how it is defined. So now I need to tell Streamlit application that if in the scenario that user click on that button, which in this case in line 50 model name is yin, Y-I-N, then in the back end the function should be pointing to that yin test1 function that we just talked about. And that's exactly what's happening. So here you have a Python function. That's exactly what we just saw in the notebook earlier. That's call in test1, and that's a GET request calling that URL, right? This is a function that we just talked about. So now all we need to do is call that function. So in this line of code, precisely line 332, I say if model name is yin, Y-I-N, Y is capitalized, then we define a query, we define a key to be 1, 2, 3, and we create an API URL. That's exactly that URL that we can invoke to call that Lambda function that we just designed. So that's the variable we throw in the call in test1 function. And there you go. That's all we need. That's the function that's pointing to that URL, which can invoke that Lambda function, and then it will give us an output. And that output, you can later on display it on the main page portion of your Streamlit application. So there you go. Thank you everyone for watching this video. I hope you enjoy a lot. I know I had a lot of fun designing this whole pipeline, right? And we came a long way. We start with Python function, and then we make a API call to OpenAI. We use Docker container to build an image, we tag it, and then we push the image to an ECR container, build a Lambda function that's backed by that image in ECR container, and then we stand up an API endpoint, point to the Lambda function. Now this whole thing is a full circle. Everyone on the internet can make that call, can call that URL, and then they can access that OpenAI function that we just designed in Lambda. Obviously in the end shut down, right? Use a different key or something so that people online don't blow up your API quotas. So with that being said, I hope you enjoy it. If you like the video, give a like and hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.